Today we have Chad Post gracing Harshaneeyam. Chad Post is a powerhouse for promoting international literature. He leads Open Letter Books, publishing Global Voices. He's the managing editor of 3%, a blog and review site promoting literature and translation, and also home to the Translation Database, the Best Translated Book Awards, and the 3% and 2-month review podcasts. He is also the author of The 3% Problem, Rants and Responses on Publishing, Translation, and the Future of Reading. He received the 2018 Words Without Borders Ottaway Award for the promotion of international literature. In this episode, Chad spoke about his stint at Dalkey Archive, Open Letter Books, and trends in not-for-profit publishing. You can follow 3% Podcast by following the links given in the show notes. He started the conversation by talking about his love for books, mentioning how they have been a constant source of enjoyment and inspiration in his life.
I was a reader from a very, 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 very young age. My parents will tell the story that every birthday, like when I was 4 and 5, like at that age, maybe even, I don't think 3, but like very young, when I was like in preschool moving on, I would get up in the morning on my birthday and be like, now I'm 1 year older, so I should be able to read. And at like 5, I like got up in my memory. I got up on my birthday. I opened up a picture book and was like, I understand everything. Now, this is probably not true, but by the time I was in kindergarten, I was reading most things. I ended up skipping first grade because of like the verbal stuff. Like it wasn't up to the level that I was at. So I was reading a lot. And from then on, like I spent most of my time in libraries, reading whatever I could. There was a point in time where I remember reading like a computer, how to do programming in BASIC manual because it was like around. And I was like, oh, that seems like a useful skill. But I had a tree house at my house and would just sit in there in the summers and read. And we were out in like the country, didn't have a lot of like nearby friends. And so I did that. It was mostly like a lot of science fiction, a lot of like fantasy stuff, a lot of like Black Beauty. Like, I don't know if you know this series, like this horse series about like a famous racing horse. So that wasn't the racing horse one, but there's always like horse stuff, like those kind of YA type of books from that period. And then just sort of kept moving on and always had a book going, always had multiple books going, always was like just deep into the idea of reading and of like enjoying literature as literature. So it's just always been there. I can't remember a time obviously where I couldn't read, and I can't imagine a time where I'm not.
Oh, were your parents teachers?
No. Well, sort of. My mom was a math teacher. She was a geometry teacher and algebra. My dad was at that time like a golf equipment salesman. They both since retired. But neither of them were literary at all. Like I think the last book my dad read was like probably 15 years ago, and it was like a biography of a famous football quarterback.
Okay.
That's it.
Okay. What did Julio Cortázar do to you?
Julio Cortázar broke me. So when I was in college, I had taken Spanish throughout high school as like the language that they took. They only really offered that in like French, but basically just Spanish. And so then in college, I took Spanish as like the requirements. And up until in one of the later required classes, we started reading like short stories, and there were short stories without the English translation next to them. So no more like parallel text, just the story itself. And I read Continuity of the Parks by Julio Cortázar, which is assigned to us. And I was like, okay, I think I get this. But then again, I'm like, what the fuck? Is this a book that like this book is circled back? Like, what is happening here? Like, for anyone who doesn't know, like there's reading, and then like suddenly you realize he's reading about what's happening to him. So it's got this meta sort of like meta level to it, or recursive structure. And it's like, well, I don't know what this is. Like, maybe I don't understand Spanish at all anymore. Maybe or I've discovered something really cool. So I went and got the short story collection, it's Blow Up and Other Stories, and started reading that and was like absolutely transfixed. Like, I read it in English. I didn't bother with the Spanish. I was like, I need to know what I'm doing here or what I've been reading. And I was just absolutely just enthralled, all in, started reading all of his books. And from there led to like Borges, led to like all the different like boom authors, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. This was like it all seems so weird to think about discovering those authors, but it is like when you're like a sophomore, junior in college here, I teach at a college. So I know like these students like backgrounds of reading. It tends to be pretty spotty, and like even like the big name authors, you might just not be aware of. Like I've had students in my class not know who Flaubert is, and like you're just like, wait, what? They're like Borges too. And so like I was at that moment where like those things were like percolating. Maybe some of them had been in the background, but once I got locked in, I was there for it. And that essentially led to a whole career in this. Like, because I really, really, really liked like more experimental, strange, adventurous type of writing and books, like the Southern Cone authors, Argentine authors in particular, were very meaningful to me. But like a lot of Latin American authors that were playing with form, they were playing with like the nature of storytelling, of how things can be presented. I was just in for all of those. And then after I graduated from college, all I wanted to do is work at bookstores. And I ended up working at a couple bookstores. And at both of them would be like ordering into the system tons of like international literature. That's where I discovered Dalkey Archive at Schuler Books and Music when I worked there in Grand Rapids, Michigan. A different bookseller had ordered a ton of Dalkey books and was like, this is the sort of thing you like. You should be paying attention to this press. So I started reading all of those. And through there was finding like French authors, like the Olympian authors, started reading more Scandinavian books, started creating like a whole kind of interest in like wider world literature.
How many pages used to read daily those days?
Probably at that point, probably like 50 or 60. Like that was pretty early on. I still had like, you know, friends and burgeoning family, and had like obligations to things. Now I'm like, no, now I read like 100 pages a day. And some of it will be like editing stuff, some of it will be not, but like it's higher. I think my volume is higher now. Although I do recall quite frequently on like breaks in college, like during our like winter recess or whatever, I would just sit up and read like a whole book during a day and night. Just like, it'd be like, this is going to, like, I start it in the morning, throughout the day, read bits and pieces, do other things. And then late at night, just be like reading until like 3 a.m. and finish something. Like, I think Howard's End was one of those books for me, but there was like, and all the Virginia Woolf books, but like for the most part, like that was a little bit more like, I was still focused on school. I was still like, doing lots of things, but yeah, decent amount.
Yeah, you were talking about reading Dalkey Archive.
Yes. So we found a lot of things through there, and generally didn't really, aside from my like longstanding interest in Spanish literature, which is reflected in Open Letters catalog, I didn't like really truly specialize. It was more broad ranging, and looking for things that were unique and strange, and sort of on the experimental end of things was more important to me than the country or language that they came from. Which led to one of the more like significant things that I did at a bookstore was in Raleigh, North Carolina at Quail Ridge Books. I worked there for a couple years and was doing like inventory. And at one point when I was on this like journey of trying to find books from different countries, read things like that were recommended, I took all of our inventory and like sorted it out into books from particular regions. So we had like, I think 9 regions more or less that were like labeled as such, and put like essentially the translations into a translated literature section organized by area, so that people who are like going on a trip somewhere could look at that section. People who are like intrigued by like Gabriel Garcia Marquez could find all these other books that were like in that vein. And it like quadrupled our sales of those books. Like by putting them together, it created a critical mass that attracted like a real audience. As a result, the bookstore won the Bookstore of the Year award from Publishers Weekly the ensuing year, with that being like one of the kind of bits of like what makes the store unique. And to this day, they still have that same section there, but like growing out, which was very cool, and was very like, it felt very gratifying. And even if it is like kind of a complicated thing, like you don't want to like separate out the books and like be like, well, these are other books, or these are like, we have the fiction and then we have the international fiction. At the same time, from a marketing standpoint, when there is, at that point in time, in like the year 1998, there are so few translations being published in English by US publishers that like they were easily getting lost. There was like the famous number of the 3% would have been at that time absolutely true. And it still is. And it may have been even lower than, it may be lower than 3% now, because of the way that fractions work and percentages. But generally speaking, at that time, there are probably like 200 new translations coming out in a given year out of like 150,000 books. So it's like they were just being lost. So like being able to put them together allowed people it was a discovery tool at that time that you could go into a bookstore and discover something that you otherwise may just glance right over, or that the names are unfamiliar. So you just don't like even track them. So that was a really important thing. And that led to eventually sort of the concept that we had at Dalkey Archive once I moved there. From the bookstore, there was the story is that there was a magazine that Dalkey started producing, like a tabloid called Context Magazine. I don't have a copy with me here, but I do at home. And it was a tabloid newspaper print magazine. It was given out for free to booksellers and to academics in batches of like 25 to 100. So you'd get a stack of like a box of a stack of these. And if you were like one of the bookstore and academic advisors, and I was one of them. So I'd get a box, and my job was to like distribute that to the readers who might be interested in the sort of fiction being covered. And the tabloid had like readings of various Dalkey authors, but also Dalkey adjacent authors. It had excerpts from like public domain books that were part of the same tradition, excerpts from Dalkey books, some other things, interviews, letters, eventually letters from different countries over like what was going on in Norway, what's going on in Serbia, like that sort of thing. Reading lists that were generated by various academics and booksellers, and then like book reviews. And so it was like perfect. It's like such the perfect literary magazine for that space and that time. This is all like pre-internet in so many ways. And so it's like, it's such a hard thing to explain to most people, because they're like, well, why, you'd get this paper magazine and like devour it. And that was how you learned about like authors. And it'd be like, yeah, there was no like, Google didn't really work. Like nothing really worked. Like there was like, I remember there being a search engine called Northern Lights that was supposed to be like the literature book website search engine. Nonsense. So this magazine was perfect for like getting information out and being able to distribute it to this group of people who were like on the and in the sort of ballpark of these sort of titles. And in that there was an advertisement for a apprenticeship that you would come to Dalkey Archive, work for 1 year, be paid like a graduate school stipend, and then you would, over the course of this year, learn all of the different parts of publishing: marketing, publicity, editorial, fundraising, administration, distribution, sales, the whole kind of gamut of things. And so I applied and was one of the first 2 apprentices that came on board. The other one didn't last so long. She left in like a month and a half. But I started out doing marketing stuff, because there's always a belief that if you worked in a bookstore, you would know how to market books better than someone who hadn't seen that sort of face-to-face interaction. And then moved into doing editorial. And then very quickly, I didn't even finish the apprenticeship. I was hired like full-time 4 months in. And then within a year was like kind of the associate director, and eventually was officially named the associate director. As part of that, Dalkey always had shifted its sort of like publishing vision, not in terms of like the aesthetic or the type of books they wanted to publish, but it started out doing only reprints. Then it was doing a lot of original books by American authors, then sort of a mix of things. There'd be periods where it would be more voluminous, like a higher number of books coming out a year, and then they cut it back down. Like there are different points in time for different strategic reasons that the list was shaped. And early on when I started, like it was probably like 2002, was when the NEA made their kind of pronouncement that according to their research, which was, methodologically interesting and maybe not like as rigid as one might hope for or expect, they did find that like their assumption that 3% of all the books being published in America were translations. And so that was a motivating factor for both John O'Brien, myself, and the NEA, the head of the NEA literature department at that time, Cliff Becker, who unfortunately passed away before seeing like his kind of vision truly come to fruition. But the idea was that that's a bad thing for American culture. If you don't have other voices coming in from other parts of the world being written in different ways, using different sort of techniques, literary and cultural and societal, all the different things that you could learn from international books, then you were becoming like a closed off culture that'd be very insular, that'd be very like self-gratifying and isn't really connected to the rest of the world. So John and I started going out to there's a bit of a story where he had met at a party the head of Philly, the Finnish Institute for Literature and Translation. She was like, her name was Iris, and she was talking to him, and he's like, we would like to, Dalkey's always done translations, and they always had. One of their first original books is a French book of French translation. They were always committed to it, but not in the same way that they became committed to it. So she was talking about how for Finnish literature, they try so hard to get their books translated into other languages, but that they had completely given up on America. That America, they had received like zero response. They would mail things out and nobody would like contact them. They would hear nothing. There's no books being translated. There was like one translator that they could identify who was like an academic doing it like more or less part-time. There's just nothing. So they're like, we don't even think about America anymore. And so we realized pretty much through that moment that that's probably true about a lot of countries. And that did turn out to be the case, that a lot of countries that have foreign book offices designed to promote their literature, we've just been like, we don't even care because you guys don't pay attention to us. And it's just a waste of money. So we set about kind of going across the world as much as we can. Primarily Europe was because that was where a lot of these cultural institutions are centralized and have like various funding from the government and as like for the ministries to like support this exchange. So we started getting invited to all these different European countries on these like individual editorial trips where John O'Brien and myself would go, and we spend like a week and they would set up everything for us. They'd pay for the flights, the hotels, and then set up all these meetings. And we meet with a number of different publishers, book critics, some authors. If there were like a translator around, that'd be great. Sometimes an academic, the cultural institutions themselves, like anyone that made sense to get a sense to truly learn what is the literary scene here. So even like countries that you'd be sort of vaguely, you'd think you're familiar with already, like Austria. Like you go to Austria and be like, oh, there's like a whole set of publishers we've never heard of. There's a lot of these Austrian authors that just have never risen to like our awareness. And so we'd find them, and through those editorial trips, which we took extremely seriously, almost every single one resulted in a series of at least 5 books that would be translated from that country to try and give American readers and English readers generally an overview of what was happening there. And that's why like a lot of the books that are in those series, I'm thinking the Estonian one in particular, that the Estonian one begins with like a number of authors who had passed away that were books from like an earlier period of time, but are the core books for Estonian literature. The like truly like artistic, have lasted, are important books from Estonia, and then also contemporary ones, and try and provide that sort of like broader range of like, here's like a literary peak that you can see, like a digestible set of books. And that was kind of that feels very connected to me with the idea of the bookstore, where I was trying to figure out like, what can we see? What can we find from these regions of the world? And then expand out from that and be on the side, rather than like from a bookstore where you're just taking what people publish and promoting it, to be able to say, this is what deserves to be published and possibly promoted.
John O'Brien, I read a couple of his interviews. He seems to be a person with a supreme intellect and with very firm opinions, right? Any interest?
Well, yeah. There's a lot. Was a very complicated man, very complicated relationships. Very, very, very smart editor, very smart reader. He too spent like most of his life just in books, which is a commonality between him, myself, and like a lot of our authors who are like just truly like bibliophile, like graphomaniacs, like that are just like into it. I mean, even if you look at Dalkey's catalog, and I'm writing a book about Dalkey Archive slowly but surely, and going through a lot of the backlist and collecting stories about John and about the press's history. But if you go through it, like one of the things that's always been clear is that a huge swath of Dalkey books are about depressed dudes trying to write a book. They're obsessed with books and they're trying to write a novel and it's going to make their life somehow better. Maybe they'll win the love of the girl. Maybe they'll just like accomplish, but they're always trying to write a book. So like that vibe runs throughout and is like part of this like obsessive literary quality. But John was a great editor. He was very strategic in like certain ways with like how to build a company, how to build a publishing house that truly flew in the face of everything that worked. Like doing books that are reprints at a time, like who wants to buy a book that already existed that you can find on the used market, making that successful, finding the way to do the translations, finding the funding for these things, doing things that were like completely not part of the mainstream, that were counter programming to like the current trends, all with like the same vein of like somewhat of the arts for art's sake, but also of like this idea that form is more valuable than function, and that form and content like relate to each other, but that there is an importance to how things are structured beyond like what is being said. It's how it's being said that's more key. So like that was always like constant, but that's very rarely in fashion. Generally things are not that, because that's considered complicated, difficult, esoteric, hermetic, like that sort of vibe. So, but we figured out how to make it work. Like, and he did it in ways that were both like incredibly smart and genius, and sometimes that were incredibly like belittling and difficult. Like in terms of treatment of the employees, payments towards people, the amounts of payments, how things were like done in this very like poor mouth style of like, we don't have anything, we're just getting by, and like trying to sort of taking advantage of that nature of the business to like truly expand Dalkey Archive. So he was a very complicated, he burnt so many bridges. He burnt the bridge with me in 2006. And that led to the creation of Open Letter. And it was in 2019 that I recontacted him for the first time. So it was a long period without him, but yes, he was very firm opinions, which I love. Like he was like a true mentor and father figure to me at the time when I worked there and was growing up, was becoming like a real adult and not like a college adult. And the idea of the firm opinions and being able to state them baldly and emphatically is something that greatly appeals to me. I mean, it's gone too far now with Twitter culture being sort of that vein, but like the idea of like writing a rant or writing a thing where you're just like, this is what I like, this is what I believe, this is my thing, bam, like, and not hedging and wishy-washy and hand wringing. Like, I love that. I think that that's something that we do not have as much of right now. And it's kind of fun, and it is unique. It did make him a very polarizing figure, but one that got a lot of attention as a result.
Any memorable experience with him that you can share?
One of the things that's very interesting is like, oh God, there was like a lot of the memories of John are him sitting somewhere smoking cigars, like kind of nonstop, and just talking through and rehashing the same ideas and concepts over and over and over again. So like there were times where like half of a workday would just be like having lattes and listening to him recount, like, how could we do this? What could we do better? Let's think of this. What about this idea? How about we do this? It would just kind of be the same ideas, and the opinions would switch back and forth. Now, one of the main memories related to that, and that he referred to several times, but what's interesting is that I have a whole lacuna. I don't remember a chunk of this, but one of the places that we went to pretty early in our journeys throughout Europe was Amsterdam. We stayed at this hotel that was the Writers Hotel, the Ambassador Hotel. I think that's what the name of it was. And it's a hotel that was referred to as the Writers Hotel because it had a library, and people who stayed there, all the writers that came to Amsterdam would stay there, and they would leave behind like a signed copy of their book. And they had a big book that you would sign an autograph for having stayed there as like a literary person. And it would expand, it include film, art, whatever. But like it was primarily a book thing. And so we stayed there, and it was really like a beautiful, quaint, interesting hotel. This is a side note you're going to probably want to cut, but it is one of my funniest stories. Is it was staying there that I was trying to watch TV late at night, and I saw the one and only episode of The OC, this popular like teen drama back in the day, like super hokey, cheesy, like West Coast, like rich West Coast kids like surfing. And in this episode, Paris Hilton is a guest star. And the only reason I remember this is that they're having a party and Paris Hilton is there and they're like, come on, Paris, let's go to the after party. She's like, no, I got to get home and study. I'm writing my dissertation on Thomas Pynchon. And I was like, that's the greatest joke I have ever seen on television. So, but we were in Amsterdam and I do have a Pynchon tattoo. I don't know if you can see it there. So, when we're in Amsterdam, when we were there, we were meeting with all the different agents, the different publishers. We also went to Belgium and I found we'd already been interested in a couple of Belgian authors and found a number of them and did a lot for Belgian literature and translation. But we would go out from this hotel and there was a bench outside on the canal because it was right on the canal. And we went and would sit on this bench and he would smoke his cigars and we'd talk about like the future and what the future plans would be. The specifics of that, I don't remember. I do remember sitting on the bench. I went back to Amsterdam 2 years ago and with a friend, went back to that hotel, found the bench. I have a picture of it on my phone and know exactly what it was. And he later, when we got like created our bridge again, and we're talking again and talking about the future of Dalkey, he referred to this several times where he'd say like, this is just like the conversation on the bench in Amsterdam. We're finally doing what we said we would do on the bench in Amsterdam. And he repeated it enough times. I was like, I don't know that I know what he's talking about. And I'm not going to ask him because I'd be like, what do you mean to mention Amsterdam? But like, that's kind of like a core John memory. That, and one of the funniest things, and this really is going to make some people queasy, but it was true. So we, in the early 2000s, when Dalkey was located in the basement of John's house, it was out in the country, this place called Funk's Grove. It's remote from the remote cities. It's like middle of nowhere. Feels like you're driving to the end of the earth amid cornfields, truly. And so you had this very nice house, very large amount of land, million dogs. And we would receive so many printed manuscripts a week. We would probably get upwards of 100 full-length written manuscripts a week or proposals, but like tons and tons and tons of paper. And if you had to, there's back in the day where you sent self-addressed stamped envelopes. And if you didn't, your stuff was going to be destroyed essentially, but nobody wants to know that. So when we would read and reject manuscripts, we'd put them in a box. And then every Friday we would stand out in the lawn and burn them. So we would just start a bonfire and just burn all these people's like hopes and dreams. It's like, we were not going to publish them, so they might as well just go up in smoke. And one of the funnier days was that we were doing this and talking and blah, blah. And all of a sudden I turn around and half of his yard is on fire because God. Like the wind had blown some poor dude's manuscript halfway across his lawn and caught all these leaves on fire. So he spent like 20 minutes like running around stamping out like little fires from like some person's manuscript. That's a key one. But John also like infamously would be like, at any point in time, come to the office, like my office where I was working, be like, got to come in and talk to me. And you sit down and it would either be like a lament about his like love life or like troubles he was having, or more likely to be like, here's publishing lesson number 742. And there'd been like a call that he got or an email. And he's like, so this situation, this is what this situation is. And here's what we could do. And here's the problems with it. And here's this agent doing this or asking for that. And that's why this doesn't make sense or why we would do it this way. Or maybe we can get away with this. And he would just like put forth like a very box off kind of like lesson. And that would be it. And he did that so frequently. Like it was very interesting because it could be very entertaining. It generally felt like he was just trying to blow off steam, but also frequently it was like he had to figure something out. And like the only way to figure it out was through this conversation. But yeah, there's like, there's so many John stories. There's just so many.
Yeah. Before we move on to open letter books, about your famous 3%. In fact, I was reading your blog on Dalkey Archives, recent posts on your blog. And there is a lot of analysis, data analytics and all that stuff. This fascination with numbers, has it got to do anything with your mother being a maths teacher?
Probably. I was like remarkably good in math as a kid. Like they'd have those they have math competitions where like you do your math quiz or whatever it was, and then go to the next level, like regionals and then blah, blah, blah. And I would get to the state finals several times for like math competition. And it was like pretty dorky, but like kind of fun. I never placed at states. I wasn't that good, but I was like very competent in it. And then, and so possibly my mom was very into that sort of thing and was constantly wanting, to understand math. But there is something very appealing to me about it that goes beyond any sort of like personal, upbringing, is that the way that math works is sort of similar to me, like how poetry works and somewhat how books, novels can work as well, except that it's very concrete. Like it fits together. Things with like, I don't understand advanced math at all. Like I like the concepts. We're publishing a book at Open Letter called Attila by Alyosha Cole that includes a ton of like obscure 3-dimensional space geometry, terminology and things. And I love the concept of it, the vision of it, the sort of understanding of it. But I'm just more of like a straightforward arithmetic, algebra, and statistics as a big one sort of numbers person. But it has that objectivity that's really interesting, that things fit together right. And you can see how they fit together and how things can be solved for. And with like books that have like, I'm very curious, I'm very obsessed with like structures and like ways that things are placed. And so numbers seem to fit in with that. It's very like, they're very similar to me of like, how do you rearrange this to make it equal X? And so I was always obsessed with that, but then math always just felt second nature to me. It was very fun. And then it became all about baseball statistics. And like, I'd always like been a baseball fanatic. I love baseball cards. I collect so many of them. They're now sitting in my basement. I think I've decided to just formally throw them out, but like I had so many and I would read the backs and memorize people's like batting average. But then like early in the 2000s and into, in later years, as baseball analytics became more and more widely known and ways of like reevaluating reality, reevaluating these situations by using a different sort of number, a different sort of way of framing that, it's finding value in like taking certain other aspects of a person's performance and figuring out how they rank against people. I was down that rabbit hole and still am. Like things like that is like a secondary obsession that's like pretty intense. It's like there have been years where I'm just like so deep into like all the baseball statistics that it's like I can barely communicate with people. I'm just like, oh, do you know about like Aaron Judge's WRC plus over the past 2 weeks sort of thing? And they're like, get out of here, man. Like, that is not fun. We are at a bar. But so that sort of, then I've always wondered how to like merge that with publishing stuff, because publishing famously doesn't pay attention to very many numbers. There's sales numbers, there's profit numbers, but things are pretty basic and they're pretty much in the like profit and loss, strictly algebraic sort of way of looking at things. We're going to pay, it's going to cost us X thousands of dollars to produce this book. We will sell it at this price. It's likely to sell this many copies based on previous experiences. It will net this amount of money as a profit. Therefore, we greenlight it. And that's all fine, but that's a very like individualistic, like small way of looking at something, trying to get like a bigger picture of like, what are the trends? What are the different people doing? Where are things happening? How can you use like sort of even just the counting statistics of like how many books are from places to like say something about our culture larger than simply like, oh, we are going to do this one book because we think it will make us $50,000. Like that's generally been the attitude. And one of the problems with publishing, like historically, that's sort of maybe changing a bit, but it's still like, truly nascent in terms of our industry for whatever weird reason, is like data research within like a marketplace. Like there's very little of it. Like you talk to like the publishers like Morgan Entrekin. There's a famous story I heard secondhand about Morgan Entrekin, but I believe to be absolutely true, is that he gave a presentation at, so it was to some big group of people that were like, some were involved in film industry. I think it was for the National Book Foundation. It was like people in the arts, but also like, potential donors, I believe. And he went through and talked about Grove and its history and publishing and blah, blah. And this guy that was in like the film industry was like, so what research do you do to decide how many copies you print of a book? And Morgan's like, none. It's my gut. It's aspirational. All of publishing is aspirational. I think we can sell 5,000 copies. We print 5,000 copies. He's like, but you don't know? And he's like, no, we don't know anything like that. It's just aspirational. So like, I think that's the beautiful thing about publishing, where it is like one person sort of imposing their will in a way, like an editor or a publisher being like, I think this book is important and going to be good and sell well, and we're going in on it. And we're just going to make this art. We're going to make this thing exist in the world, and we will attract people to it. That's brilliant. I think I love that sort of moxie within every sphere of like arts, like movies, TV. People are taking swings at things and trying to do that. But then I also like do like the idea of like, what do we know about people who read? What do we know about like what's going on here? What does that mean? How can we value these books outside of simply saying this was a bestseller, this sold X thousand copies? Like, what other ways are there to appreciate and value a book that may have some other statistical basis, or could just be like through other forms of like understanding of the word value? But that's become a more obsession of mine. Going back to your question about the 3% part of it, the 3% part of it came about through the two different main sources. The NEA came up with the one, as I mentioned, like in around 2002, 2003. And basically they had gone through Publishers Weekly, Library Journal, Kirkus Magazine, and counted how many reviews there were and how many of those were for translated books. The number was 3%. They assume that's somehow like a snapshot of reality and go with it and say like, this isn't a formal study, but this is what we found. Hence, we would like the NEA to try and address this problem and change that percentage. Then a few years later, Esther Allen was helping relaunch the Penworld Voices Festival and got in touch with Bowker, who keeps track of all ISBNs. And you have to, when you insert your metadata, Bowker gets your metadata. So they have a certain amount of information there. But what they don't have is if they used to have a box apparently where you say this book is translated, but they eliminated that. So then they no longer had that information. But someone did crunch the data, tried to figure it out, came up with some like wad swathy sort of like ways that you can bundle data and put it into different buckets, came up with the concept that 3% of all the books that had been published the previous year were in translation. So you're like, at least these two sources from two different approaches to it seem to represent this. So the 3% number is popular. So we start our website 3% before Open Letter is going to publish a book, but as a way of like a runway. Start talking about books, start making a name for ourselves, get an audience so that when we announce our books, they're there, all that kind of stuff. And we named it 3% for the reason that we were doing only translations. We wanted to draw attention to the lack of them and to use it as a potential fundraising tool to say, hey, if you want this number to be higher, we need funding to be able to change this. Isn't this an important literary cause? It's already really, really hard to get people to donate to books, to publishing. It's like unsexy. It's very like low sort of rate of return in terms of like your name being out in the world. You're like the visibility of books is much lower than say donating to like a museum. Like there's a lot of things that make it less appealing to like big name donors. But we thought like within that, like instead of just saying like, oh, we need you to help us so that we can print this book, we're saying like, we need you to help us allow these voices to be heard from these other parts of the world. This is a more powerful argument in so many ways. So we name it that. At this, I end up being invited to Iowa to be part of like the Iowa, their international writing program was having I think it was like 20th or 25th year anniversary celebration. I was on a panel with Elliot Weinberger about the state of like translations in America today. And beforehand, Elliot's like, that 3% number is a lie. He's like, I'm on committees for like various prizes and I receive like every translated book in the year. And there are not that many. It's not 3% of that. There cannot be. And so I was like, okay, man, like, that's cool. Like, I don't know if you're like taking shots or like what this really is. But I was like, you know what? If that's true, we can count them. So we started the translation database and I just went through every possible source that was available, catalogs, publishers' websites, Ingram's iPage, everything that I could to find. There used to be like a list of translated books received through the translation review journal. Everything that I could find, just put it all in, looking only at books that had been translated for the first time, and came up with in the very first year, 2008, that there were 360 works of fiction and poetry translated into English and published in America in that year. In that year, there were approximately 55,000 works of fiction and poetry that came out. So it truly wasn't 3% at all. And it was actually so small that it was like, you could read all of these in the year. There's like, that's possible. But that number, strangely, the 3% number, and this might be like speaking to the way people relate to math, the 3% number was always like powerful, but in a weird way. Like it was like, oh, we need to make it 4% or 5%. And you're like, I don't think that's how this works, because there's just more stuff. So the numerator and denominator are increasing. You have to increase faster than the denominator. That's never going to work. But then once you put out the real number and you're like 360, people are like, oh, that's not cool. And suddenly there was like a lot more interest in people expanding, adding on books, new publishers come into existence, translations start to be done, and the number moves up into the 600s, which is, still minuscule. But at the same time, like solid, like almost doubling what was there, and actually like a robust enough community that there are people who are like translation aficionados who have not read everything and are finding new authors all the time. And that's kind of like the best you can ask for. Sure, if we were like 10,000, there'd probably be more sales for translations. They'd be more like commonplace. There'd be no question. There'd be no need to like put them in their own category ever. That's all very true. But like the sort of like the way that the book marketplace works, the way that it works for publishers, that's probably never going to happen.
Yeah, giving a number actually, whether it's right or wrong, accuracy, you can forget it. But it makes such a powerful statement being such a small number, 3.
There is a side problem that 3% was our thing. It branded it as the website. It did way too much to promote it. Like sort of like shying away from it now and focusing on like, what are the books, not just what is the number? What are these books about? What are the trends within the books themselves, and less about like how many. But I do like to have a finger in both pies. But there is a violently right-wing conservative group of people in America called the 3%ers. And when they became a thing and became popular on various searches, they show up above us. And for a while, like it would be sort of a competition, because I would then do something so we'd get enough hits that then would put us back on top. But but that's not the case anymore. If you just type in 3%, you're most likely going to land on like a website you're not comfortable with.
Then how did open letter books happen?
So Open Letter happened when I'd split from John and split from Dalkey. And I had been in touch with the University of Rochester for various reasons, including that Dalkey was initially going to move here, and that didn't happen. So I contacted them and was like, I don't work for Dalkey anymore. I don't know if you guys are still interested in having some sort of publishing operation. And they were like, yes, absolutely. We couldn't contact you because of the nature of like the dissolution of this agreement, but you can contact you. Since you contacted us, it's fair game. So we had a conversation and came up with the concept of starting a press, which became called Open Letter, but starting a press that would do 10 to 12 works of high quality literature and translation every year. And that those books would go, be able to be promoted so that they'd bring attention to the university. They would address somewhat of that 3% problem. And very importantly, they would be part of of academic programs to train people in literature and translation. Which we were at the forefront of this kind of wave of the idea that comp lit is one thing, but maybe translation is like an even more contemporary version of that, in which people should be reading books from all over, not just from England or America when they're studying English literature, but studying literature more broadly. This sort of allows that possibility. There is like the skill and art and craft of learning how to translate combines so many elements of like academia, from like the creative writing side of things to like the being able to parse and understand how to read a book part of things, to like the kind of critical analysis of like, you can't translate if you can't kind of analyze the book itself. And those are all key factors. So we started an undergraduate program and a graduate program at the same time, basically, to involve people in both the learning of how to do literary translation, but also how to be involved in publishing. How do those books, it's one thing for someone to translate a book in a void and just do it for fun and for the intellectual exercise. It's another thing to know how that intellectual exercise ends up in the hands of someone in New York City on a subway enjoying and learning about a different culture through that book. So the program sort of has those kind of two beats to it. So that's how Open Letters like foundation came to be, that this was going to be the case. It would be there as part of that. And we launched our first book in the fall of 2008, Dubrovka Greshik's Nobody's Home. And before that, we had always we worked with like figuring out what titles to do, what our covers would look like, our distribution, all of that backdoor stuff, or like the back room, important like logistical things. And then the press launches and starts to get like a good amount of attention and grows from there to the point where like we are much bigger than we were before. And we have had like good success for a number of books, discovered a number of things that have been quite popular for us, such as Matthias Enard's Zone. And Matthias Enard's a big figure now, published currently by New Directions. We also like Alejandro Zambro. We published one of his early books. Merce Rodoreda, who we continue to publish, is a Catalan author that is one of our best-selling authors for all of her books. And then more recently, Elisa Chua-Dusapen, a sort of Swiss writer writing in French who is part Korean, who won the National Book Award for us in translation. And her books are like our best-selling titles. Like we truly like struck gold with her in terms of a like very widespread audience alongside the literary focused audience. She kind of straddles those lines. So that's more or less how it started. It was, I mean, in some ways, like there's not like a really fun adventure narrative to it. It was more like a couple meetings with some deans who are like, yeah, we're in on this, and then working with various elements of the university to be like, how can you use us to promote yourself? So they use us to raise money. They use us to get attention for various programs, to attract students to the university. Almost everyone who comes to the translation program is doing it because they want to have the internship with Open Letter and to learn from that experience. So it's very beneficial to the university at large. And we continue. They don't have any, to make it clear in case there's the question, they don't have any editorial oversight. So they do not say like, you cannot publish this book or you must clear it through us first. They do not do that. We're treated exactly like a nonprofit independent press that's just at a university. There's been like editorial boards over a period of time. People are like informed, but generally speaking, it's like hands off. You guys know what books to do, figure it out. And so that's very key. And that's very important. Because that sort of interference would be like, could be potentially sticky. But they are very supportive. We do things with the other departments like modern languages and cultures, English department, at times like linguistics, philosophy, and there's like a good integration. The humanities center on campus, the libraries, like we do kind of blend over into a bunch of different fields because we're not so specific within like one discipline that we're stuck there. And then we have a lot of students, a lot of interns, a lot of people that sort of float around through our business.
You touched upon it briefly, the kind of books that you like. Can you tell us what kind of books that you look for? Anything specific?
Yeah, it's always a tough question. So like on the biggest level, the thing that's important to me is that a book has a unique fingerprint, but that it is unlike most other things you've read. There's no way to say like, this is a unique book that has never existed. Like most everything, has some antecedents, some precedents, but like for the most part, the books that we're looking for are books that have like something about them that's new, that feels like a new concept, a new way of doing things. I am very obsessed with the structure and definitely things that are more towards the experimental end of things, where it's not neo-realistic. Like I do not enjoy reading books that are like written as if you're watching the movie, that everything is like concrete and like spelled out. Everything's articulated. There are no like gaps for the reader to fill in. There has to be that participation, that there's something about the book that leaves like an incompleteness or a sort of challenge or a sort of puzzle that the reader has to like engage with to really truly appreciate that book. And that's the sort of thing that we're looking for. And that was the sort of thing that was true at Dalkey, and all the books I like acquired and edited there followed that into that same sort of thing. And we carried that vibe over to Open Letter. Now, the one difference to some degree is that at Open Letter, we're much more translator centric as part of both like a kind of knee-jerk reaction to like John's treatment of translators. We sort of went the opposite way. Like rather than like kind of using them or finding like young and experienced translators you don't have to pay very much to do like kind of like rote work and just like churn things out. We went in the opposite direction of trying to honor and value translators and also give them more and more power. So there's a lot of translators that we work with who bring us books. A lot of our books come from translators, but they're translators that we'll just keep working with. And right now we've had like, a few that have done a majority of books for one reason or another, but like over time, there's ones that we like to keep going back to and we'd like to like keep working with and have that kind of meshing between like our aesthetics of like what kind of books we want to do and them as translators and work together in that way so that they are kind of lifted in the same way that they're helping us improve in all these different ways and all these different books that we're finding, great books that we're finding.
Now, you are also involved with the Armory Square Prize.
Yes. So the Armory Square Prize is really interesting. Pia Swani and Jason Grunbaum were the inventors of this. Jason Grunbaum's been a friend for 20 years. He's a Hindi translator, teaches at the University of Chicago, where he's also helped set up something called SALT to support South Asian literature and translation. And they came up with the idea that one way to bring more attention to both their program and to the literature from that region as a whole is to have a contest in which every year a book would be selected and that book would then be published. And they brought it to us and we agreed immediately to be the publisher for this because that is an area of the world that we are lacking in. And Jason, I know, has very good taste and understands like where we're coming from. So I trust in him and they put together a whole committee of readers and translators and editors and famous authors, like all these wonderful people as a committee to evaluate and come up with a short list and come up with a winner for the prize every year. I have complete faith in them. So they are selecting the book and we are publishing it. And so far there have been 2 winners that have been announced. The first book, which will be coming out theoretically in in December or January at the latest, is The Kettle Drum and Other Stories by Sadiq Alam. That's translated from the Urdu by Musharraf Al-Faruqi. And that was the first winner. And that was really cool. I mean, it was a really great experience of working with them on the prize and being able to see, like, they didn't tell me who won. I saw the short list. I read the short list stories and they were all put on Words Without Borders. It was like, there's a kind of increasing excitement. And then they're like, this is the one that won. And we're like, excellent. That's perfect. I'm down for that. These are all fine possibilities. It was wonderful. And then this year is the second run of it. So we don't have the first book out yet, which is unfortunate. But once that comes out, then it'll be like clockwork that every fall there will be a new book from this prize. And so the new winner, I have to go look this up again, is Sana Chaudhry for her translation of Fahmi Riaz's Fortress of the Forgotten Ones, although we may change that title slightly. But that then won recently, and this year's one was specifically looking for a female author. So those 2 books are coming out through Open Letter in the fall of this year and the fall of next year.
Now, you have been involved with the non-profit publishing for, I think, more than 3 decades or 2.5 decades. Tell us about their evolution and what stage that they are in now.
Yeah, it's complicated. So there was a time where nonprofit publishing in like the 80s and like mainly in the 90s became sort of a focal point, thanks to a guy named Jim Sitter, thanks to the Cliff Becker at the NEA, that there was a way of like trying to help raise the awareness of nonprofit publishing and to help kind of train nonprofit publishers. There's these famous meetings I've heard about with the Mellon Foundation and with Lila Wallace in New York, who had both agreed to fund nonprofit publishing for like pilot series, to do test runs, to see if there was like a way that they could create a system to continually fund publishing, because they fund other arts. Their other arts get funding from like any number of different large foundations in the US, but publishing does not. And at this time, there are 0 national foundations that you can apply to get funding for books. But at that point, these 2 agreed to do it. And I'd have these convenings of nonprofit publishers. And from everything I heard, it was just embarrassing. Like they would ask the rights directors, the people who were giving out the money, the grants directors, they would ask questions like, well, how many sales did you have last year? What was your best-selling title? How are you marketing these books? Where's your strategic plan? And they'd be like, we need a paper cutter. And like, I don't know exactly. There's in Dalkey Archives monthly sales, which I've kept up until this day. I've filled in all the blanks. I have the entirety of it from the day it started. And the day it starts is June 1993. Even though the press was founded in 1984, the first sales report is 9 years later. And it's because the Mellon Foundation, I believe it was Mellon, maybe Lila Wallace. I can't remember which one it was now. I think maybe it was Lila Wallace. They said, if you come to us without a comprehensive sales report, we are no longer funding you. And like, people were like, we don't know how to do this. Like, that was like the level of professionalism seems so low. It was people who were like single person, fascinated with books in their basement, figuring out how to make this happen at a time when like desktop publishing is being revolutionized. Things are possible now, but they didn't have any business backgrounds. They were like very rarely like in that world. They're very much more people who are just like, I love this book. I print this book. There we go. Done. So that was like a period where there was a great chance, a great opportunity to really expand. And what it morphed into was that Minneapolis has become the hub for nonprofit publishing. There are a lot of funding opportunities there. There are the big corporations that support and big foundations that support publishing, but it's really localized there. There's the NEA, which continues to like fund nonprofit publishing in a very important way. But unfortunately, because our government is our government, their budget hasn't increased in decades. It's the same as it was when I first started in publishing. It's the same as it was in like the early 90s. So like that, it's not increased for inflation. It's just there. So the money from that technically seems to be getting lower because things cost more. So like, even if we're getting the same amount from them, the amounts are not, it doesn't go as far as it used to by any means. So that's complicated. There are state funding systems like the NISCA, New York State Council on the Arts, Illinois Arts Council. There are certain locales like New York City has various funding, but for the most part, there's still not the critical mass of individual donations. And that's what's key. So many other of these like artistic enterprises have like a handful of big donors or enough of a reputation that attracts like bigger donations to be able to survive. Like, there are the people who donate to museums on a regular basis, people who donate to symphonies. There are people who like contribute to theaters that do all of this stuff. And for publishing, there really aren't that many people. There's maybe frequently a press will find one person, and that one person will basically fund them as much as they can for that period of time. But we don't have like a group. We don't have like a way of like working together to try and raise awareness. There are no lobbyists for literature in DC, or there's one, like, there's just not the same impetus. And everyone's like so busy, so hustling, so trying to do their own thing that the bigger picture is sort of being lost. So like, I have concerns about the future of nonprofit publishing because I don't know that we are getting the attention that we need to get from like the Silicon Valley new money folks. There's all these famous like reports and studies that like, 50 years ago, out of the top 100 donors in the year, like 94% were giving to the arts. And now it's like 6.
Cool.
Like, it's so much lower. It's just like not on the radar. Everything's for STEM, for longevity, for like, there's so many other like these scientific and computer-based ideas that are being funded and donated to, but arts and literature and just not. And so that's a problem. And I hope that there will be someone who will rise up out of this new generation who will have the foresight and the sort of savvy to bring together the right companies, the right people in the room to be able to make something happen on a much more global or like larger scale than simply like, I meet a guy in Chicago who gives us a donation every year. Like, something more systematic would be key, because we need so much support. Like, the books are getting more expensive, as I say, but like generally it's like $35,000 to produce a book with all labor, all operating expenses, advances, printing, so on and so forth. Printing has doubled in cost since the pandemic, if not tripled in certain instances. That's costing so much more. And then the shelf space is reducing. The number of books being published is much higher. The competition is stiff. Sales are sort of like, they're not going up. There'll be certain books that, accelerate and become like massive bestsellers, but your average used to be like 2,500 copies. Now it's probably like 1,500 copies. So as sales decrease, just simply because there's so much and it's so diffuse, and the costs increase, that has to be bolstered by donations. and by funding. Otherwise, a lot of these things just sort of evaporate. And we're finding there are different shifts within the publishing industry in terms of like not printing excess inventory, if at all possible, using new technologies to try and be able to be more like print to order or like in small batches so that you don't have inventory costs and you can cut down on like that upfront paying $20,000 to get a book printed. You can sort of trim that down by tying it to printing books that are sold rather than printing books that are on moving inventory. But like and finding ways to shortcut marketing by using all digital stuff that's free. All these are like attempts to try and address like a core problem, which is that we do not have the money that Penguin Random House does, that like in other industries that like Warner Brothers or Apple TV or all these things that are generating content similar to publishers as a content generating source. We don't have that money, and it's not coming to us in those ways right now. And that's a problem. And so you're addressing it through shortcuts and through various other like, big swings, big pitches. But like, it would be so much better if there was like a more standardized way that people were donating. This was on their minds of like the Elon Musks of the world, that they could change this in a second. You give $1 million to publishing is a lot.
Something very similar. What changes would you like to see in translation ecosystem?
It's a big question. I think what I would like to see is I would like there to be the focus on readership. This, I could say some controversial things, and I can also just say the general thing is that I think that for so long we've gotten off of the track of what the books are for. We like, as books, the pleasure of reading, the pleasure of books, the importance of them is paramount. And I know that matters to every person involved in this process. However, the discussions are generally about appreciation, payments, being able to like get your book published, to do all these like kind of back end things that are disconnected from a readership. Like there's still like this gap, and we've always tried to bridge that. The 3% blog was all about bringing together these different siloed areas to try and like cross-pollinate them. And it's always been a focus, but like translators and booksellers are like remote from one another. There's just not like that connection. Translators aren't necessarily, doing things to directly attract consumers. And so within the industry, we have this kind of like competing interests. Like we're trying to find a way to publish these books that makes financial sense and keeps us afloat. Translators are trying to find a way to do a job that pays them enough money to live. These two things are not exactly compatible. And part of that's due to the earlier comment I made about aspiration. Like when we offer money for an advance to an author, that is based on projected sales. That's not, and reputation, and there's other things that can come into it. And like what the value is from a financial standpoint and from a cultural capital standpoint. But we are assessing their fee based on like a sales success ratio. And for a translator, that's not the case. It's done as like essentially as labor. Like we're paying you to put out 100,000 words. We will pay you this amount of money for those 100,000 words. Those two things aren't aligned. And like, then there becomes a problem of like where translators are definitely put upon, are definitely burdened, in which you're asking them for samples. You're asking them to assess books that you can't read in their language. You're asking them for now trying to ask them to help do marketing, even if it's like very simple marketing. They're like some form of marketing to help promote the books that they've worked on, to be involved in that process. And they resist it because the fees that they're being paid are too low, that they don't feel like that they're justified. They have to move on to the next project. They will only do things that they get paid for it, so on and so forth. And unlike authors, they don't have a secondary revenue stream. Authors can write a book and then get paid 10 times what their advance was to give a speech at a university, right? Like some of these speaking fees are upwards of $50,000 to give like one event. A translator is not going to get paid $500 to give a presentation generally. So they don't have that secondary income. They rely upon something that is very, very unstable, and something that is very underpaid. Going back to, if we had funds, that would be less of an issue. If there was like a general translation fund that was helping provide money to working translators, that would change this equation dramatically. But as a result, there's this constant sort of like tension that is eliminated on the personal level, eliminated on like the work level. Everyone that we work with is lovely. I enjoy all the experiences. Editing is fun. The conversations are fun. Everything's fine. But you know that there's like still this blockade. And so trying to if you can increase the funding, you could also increase the readership. But increasing the readership requires so much. Like it's so much harder because you're trying to get into bookstores, you're trying to get onto TikTok, you're trying to get into places. Nobody knows how books are discovered anymore. Reviews don't matter so much. And yet like all of that comes back within the translation world, gets blamed on the publisher for not doing enough for that book. That whole situation is messy and doesn't seem to be playing to its advantage. It's sort of working against itself in a lot of different ways that are steps along the process that make it frustrating because you can't succeed or you can't find like the right balance there. That's something I wish would change on a general level. I think that would be very, very, very important. The influence of agents, I think, should be reduced. This is another controversial thing. I think that their attempts to like play people off of each other and essentially increase costs of doing translations and create like a weird, like take advantage of that market and create a different market for it is only going to hamstring us in the long run. Like we're not capable of paying the rates that they want to have paid. They're playing people off each other and ending up with like the wrong fit for certain books because it's about money and not about like capacity and capability. Like it's just sort of weird. And also their influence is altering the way that the type of books that come out, that which ones are coming out, are being sort of filtered through these agents because most publishers don't have the time to do their own research. So a lot of agents are controlling things and making them expensive. I know agents will listen to this. I know they'll be pissed, and that's fine. Come at me, bro. Like I'm good with like these complaints, but their influence, I think, needs to be taken down a notch. I like the more personal connections. That would be important. I think the prizes that exist for translation are great, and those just need to be publicized more. And if there were more sort of like ways of getting the word out, like if there were more attention being paid in all the minor ways or the major ways, like the New York Times will do like a translation issue every once in a while. That's brilliant. More things like that would really help like sort of stabilize the industry. But I think the big thing is like we need money, translators need money, and we need readers to make this all like really function.
That brings me to your 3% podcast. Thank you for doing it. For Harshaneeyam, 3% podcast, Words Without Borders, Asymptote are the three most important resources for us to, check about translators. That's how we get to know about translators and we write to them. These are the three most important. Why did you start it and how is it going now?
So it started from like a crazy idea where I was saying like there needs to be like this is kind of going back to your earlier question, but there wasn't at that time, podcasts barely existed. Like they were like kind of like beginning up sort of things. And I was thinking of it more as radio. As like there's no like radio show about books aside from Bookworm. It's like not there, and that's about specific books, specific author. There wasn't like a widespread thing. As like there needs to be something that's just like news, opinions, commentary, and sort of like just like that sort of John O'Brien directness and like opinion making and like bold and like cover topics. And so at the time, my friend Tom Roberge had been working at New Directions. And so we decided, it was like, let's do this. We're both good at ranting. We've got good opinion. We're funny. We can make this work. Let's do this. And we're both in the industry. We have different perspectives. This will be fun. As we started there, he ended up leaving New Directions to start his own bookstore, which became also an interesting component to it. And it went through various, like, it was generally just the two of us shooting the shit, talking about one specific topic that we'd come up with. But like sometimes they'd be a little different, like a reading club or an interview or whatever it might be. Eventually the pandemic happened and like he moved to Switzerland and like everything's like a little bit like funky with that. So just we just couldn't do it anymore, like with any regularity. And we've talked about doing it again, but the time difference is tough. Like it's just tough to really pull it off at different points in our life. It does take a bit of time. So then like there's been a number of ones that I've done where they've just been interviews, like just like one-off sort of interviews with people. And that is something that as I get more support for Open Letters marketing and for the business side of things and can focus more on editorial and creation, like creation of marketing contextual materials, I do have a plan to relaunch it in a bigger way with like a sort of very focused look at like books from particular publishers and authors and translators from those publishers. I do want to see if I can get a co-host that would be reliable if Tom can't do it and figure out that whole process. But I do think that it would be a good addition. There's so many more podcasts now. There's so many books podcasts that there weren't before. And I think that I need to personally figure out like what the niche is that it addresses. I've always had this like kind of running gag that there's no hang up and listen for books. So there's this sports podcast on Slate called Hang Up and Listen. It's been around for ages, but it's sort of like meta commentary on the commentary of sports. So it's not like it talks about sports, but it talks essentially about like what are the kind of like bad takes and what are like the sort of like, how is this being covered by the media? How is this being represented? Like a sort of second level. But we can't do that with books because we don't have enough of the first level. Yeah. You can be like, oh, there's this. Absolutely. So like I've always been like, how could we make something like that? Something that's like a little bit more like upper, like a reflection, not to take away from like the core things, but like we have the core things. Let's look at like what's next with that. And I'm trying to figure it out. I'll pulse it out. It'll happen.
Now, probably you can talk about book reviews.
The most controversial thing we ever did with 3% was dissing on book reviews. And it ended up getting emails of people. Someone emailed me and was like, this is why people won't, it was anonymous. And like, this is why some people don't want to review your books because they're afraid you're just going to make fun of them. And I was like, well, write better reviews. I don't know what to tell you. But like, yeah, that's an old John O'Brien thing too. There was in both Review Contemporary Fiction and Context Magazine a column called Reviewing the Reviewers, in which it just like took down all like the bad takes. And I would love to do that. It's dangerous as hell, but I also feel like it would be fun, like super fun. It's just that there's no criticism. What am I going to do? Make fun of a TikToker? That's like not okay. That's like picking on children.
Correct.
Like, I don't know what to do. But that's where like instead of the 3% podcast, we sort of shifted gears a bit into the 2-month review podcast, which was designed originally because I was like, we're publishing, like the first season was proof of concept that we are publishing a book called Thomas Janssen bestseller by Gudberger Bergson, Icelandic author. It's like the Icelandic Ulysses, and it is dense. It is very dense. It is very like tricksy in terms of like the time, whose point of view you're in, what's going on. But it does have an interior logic. It's very readable and super funny, but it does have like a bar to entry. And so I was like, how are we going to get people to read this? And not just like buy it because it's like Icelandic Ulysses, but like actually engage with the text and like get it. And like I read it twice and was like, I don't get it all. Like I get enough, I can see this, but like I'm reading it so fast for like editing, for getting it out, for making this happen. This whole process is like, how quickly can you get this book out? And that's like not super fun. So we started it to like go slow, read it slowly, talk about it thoroughly, and have fun. Make sure that like these books aren't scary. These books seem scary to a lot of people because they're long, they have like big reputations, so on and so forth. But they're not scary. They're frequently very fun to read. You just have to like give it the space to be there. So we started doing that as like 8-week programs on different books. Sometimes it has to be 10 or 12 given the length. And have now we're in our 23rd season and we're doing Lanark by Alistair Gray over this summer. And that's a brilliant book to cover. It's super fun. But this kind of concept has worked to the degree that I wanted it to, where I will get contacted at times and see like I don't really look into the downloads numbers that often, but it'll pop up when I do the new issue or the new episode that some of these backlist ones or past ones will suddenly become quite popular. Like everyone discovers a particular book and this comes up. And so they're evergreen in the sense that like, when the next revival of William Gaddis happens, people will find the JR podcast and listen to that. Like this will keep coming up. And that's kind of like something that means a lot to me at this stage of my career, is creating things that are like contextualizing books and leaving them for the future. So that it's not just like we produce a bunch of ephemeral things and then maybe people will read them or not, but like also like give the entryway and create something that like will have a kind of lasting impact on like providing access and providing information that will allow you to enjoy and appreciate something.
Now, this is my final question. If you were to pitch the value of translated literature to a big funding agency who is interested in literature, what would you say?
I think what I would say is that this is a crucial part of our culture, is that we, in every aspect of culture, it transcends borders, it transcends languages. You see this in Netflix all the time. You see this in movies, you see this in music, you see it in visual art. There's no point in time where you're like, oh, I don't know if I want to see any Dutch artists today because that's, foreign. Like none of that's an issue. The only place where that's an issue artistically and culturally is in books. And that books are one of the richest experiences for being able to understand the world and figure out how to see the world and how to make sense of the world, how to make sense of yourself, how to make sense of like your emotions, and also come to understand how you can present it. Like how you can convey yourself is so critical in a world where like there's a million voices all screaming at one another. To know how to like talk, how to explain is so critical. And like for literature, like the cost of doing a book, I keep saying it's like super expensive because our budgets are so low, but like it's not expensive compared to other art forms. It's so much cheaper than like producing an album. Is cheaper than producing a TV show for sure, or a movie. My God, like it's just not that expensive. And the amount that you could change in providing access to like thousands of voices from all over the world. Like there are huge swaths of the world that have very few translations coming out of, that are almost unheard of. And that's not good for any reading culture to have. But it wouldn't take very much money to change that at all. If you say every translator gets like $8,000 to do a book for like $1 million, that's like 100 books. Like that's not that difficult. Like, so I think that that's the sort of pitch would be that it is critical, and it isn't as a cost proposition. It's pretty low. You do a small investment, you've changed the world. You've made books, you've changed the literary landscape with like next to no money in the terms of like a large foundation.